Ginny Gonzalez was never the type to go unnoticed. With her infectious laughter, bright eyes, and unrelenting passion for architecture, she was a force of nature in every room she entered. In college, she was popular among her peers, not just because of her charm, but because she carried with her an undeniable sense of purpose. But no one stirred her heart as much as one particular professor, Marco Villanueva. Marco was unlike anyone Ginny had ever met. He wasn't just a history professor. He embodied the stories he told. With every lesson, he took his students on a journey through time, with a passion that spoke of a man who had lived a life full of stories. There was something about his calm and quiet strength that made him stand out. He was intelligent, reserved, and a little mysterious, often lost in his own world of books, lectures, and cultural immersion. It started innocently enough. Ginny had attended one of Marco's lectures and found herself mesmerized by his teaching style. Unlike other professors who droned on about facts and dates, Marco made history come alive. He spoke with such conviction, weaving tales of the past that felt as vibrant as the present. She was drawn to the way he carried himself, with a maturity and grace that made him seem untouchable, but deeply captivating. What began as admiration soon turned into an all-consuming crush. Ginny found herself thinking about Marco outside of class, wondering what his life was like beyond the university. What were his hobbies? Did he have a favorite song? She wanted to know everything about him. But how could she? He was a professor, after all, someone older, wiser, and far more experienced than she was. Yet, the more she tried to suppress her feelings, the stronger they became. Ginny's friends began to notice her distraction. She would linger in the hallways near his office, hoping for a glimpse of him as he passed by. She'd even go as far as asking questions during class just to hear him speak to her directly. It was clear to everyone but Marco that Ginny was smitten. The tipping point came one day when Ginny decided she couldn't keep her feelings bottled up any longer. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she drafted a letter, a simple, heartfelt confession. She wanted Marco to know how much he inspired her, not just as a student, but as a person. In the letter, she thanked him for the way he brought history to life and how his passion ignited her own. She ended the letter with a simple request: "Let me cook for you sometime." For weeks, she mustered up the courage to leave the letter on his desk. When she finally did, she quickly walked away, her heart racing, unsure of how he would react. Would he laugh? Would he dismiss her feelings? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she was too proud to let her fear stop her. To Ginny's surprise, Marco did not ignore the letter. A few days later, she found a note on her desk in class, written in Marco's careful handwriting. It simply read, "Thank you for your words. Let's have that meal you promised." Ginny could hardly believe her eyes. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the note over and over again. Was this real? Had Marco really agreed to meet her outside of the classroom? The day of their dinner arrived, and Ginny was a ball of nerves. She had prepared one of her mother's special recipes, a dish she knew by heart, hoping to impress Marco not only with her culinary skills, but with the care and thought she put into every detail. Marco arrived at her apartment, looking slightly out of place in casual clothes, but his presence was warm and inviting. He smiled politely, making small talk about the day, but Ginny could sense his curiosity about why she had invited him in the first place. As they ate, Ginny slowly began to relax. The conversation flowed naturally, moving from school topics to personal interests. Ginny was surprised to learn that Marco had a deep love for travel, particularly to places rich in history and culture. He talked about his travels to Europe, how he had wandered through ancient ruins and marveled at the architectural wonders of the world. Ginny listened intently, feeling more and more connected to him with every word. For Marco, this dinner was a revelation. He had always admired Ginny's enthusiasm in class, but seeing her outside of the academic setting, he realized there was much more to her than just a bright student. She was passionate, curious, and full of life, a stark contrast to his own calm and introspective nature. As the evening went on, Marco found himself enjoying Ginny's company more than he expected. There was an energy about her that was contagious, And for the first time in a long while, he felt something stir in him, a spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Their connection deepened over the next few weeks. What started as a dinner soon turned into long walks around campus, late-night conversations about dreams and ambitions, and moments of laughter that felt easy and unforced. Ginny was falling head over heels for Marco, and to her delight, it seemed like he was falling for her too. Despite their growing closeness, there was always an underlying tension in their relationship, an awareness that they came from different worlds. Marco was older, more experienced, and had already lived a full life, while Ginny was just starting hers. She had dreams of becoming a renowned architect, of traveling the world and making her mark, while Marco's dreams were simpler. He wanted a quiet life, to continue teaching, to settle down and build a family. These differences were subtle at first, but they lingered in the background of their relationship, like a shadow waiting to be acknowledged. As their relationship blossomed, Ginny found herself torn. On one hand, she loved Marco deeply, more than she ever thought she could love anyone. But on the other hand, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing herself in the process. Her dreams of traveling the world and becoming a successful architect seemed to be slipping away, replaced by Marco's more grounded and practical vision for the future. The thought of settling down so soon terrified her, and she began to question whether she was ready for the kind of life Marco wanted. One evening, after a particularly emotional conversation about their future, Ginny made the decision that would change everything. She told Marco she needed space to figure out what she really wanted in life. She needed time to chase her dreams and find herself before she could fully commit to anyone, even someone as wonderful as Marco. Marco, devastated by Ginny's words, tried to understand, but the pain of losing her was too much. He had always known that Ginny was ambitious, that she had big dreams, but he never thought those dreams would take her away from him. In the end, he had no choice but to let her go, even though it broke his heart. As Ginny packed her bags and walked out of Marco's life, she felt a mix of emotions, sadness, relief, and a deep sense of loss. She knew she was making the right decision for herself, but that didn't make it any easier. Marco had been her first love, and walking away from him felt like walking away from a part of herself. For Marco, the days that followed were filled with emptiness. He had given his heart to Ginny, only to have it broken. He tried to move on, but everywhere he went, he was reminded of her laughter, her energy, her passion. He had loved her with everything he had, but in the end, it wasn't enough to keep her by his side. Years passed like a blur for Ginny. She had become everything she had set out to be, a successful architect, recognized for her innovative designs, and traveling to places she once only dreamt of. She had built an impressive portfolio of work and had carved a name for herself in the industry. From the outside, she was living the life she had always envisioned, a life filled with adventure, ambition, and personal achievement. Yet something was missing. Late at night, when the noise of her busy life quieted down, Ginny would often find herself haunted by thoughts of Marco, the man she had left behind. Despite the distance and the years that had passed, Ginny still thought about him. She remembered the way he used to talk about history with such passion, how he made her feel cherished in ways no one else had since. She wondered what he was doing now, if he was still teaching, if he had found someone else. The memories were bittersweet, and as much as she tried to push them away, they lingered like an unresolved chapter in her life. Everything changed one morning when Ginny received a call from her firm about a new project. It was a restaurant, a unique concept that required not only her expertise, but also her personal touch and design. She was intrigued. The catch, however, was that the client specifically requested her by name. That struck Ginny as odd, but she brushed it off, assuming that perhaps her reputation had preceded her. What she wasn't prepared for was the revelation that the man behind this new restaurant project was none other than Marco Villanueva. Ginny's heart nearly stopped at the mention of his name. For a moment, she felt as though the world had tipped off its axis. Marco, after all these years, why now? Why this project? The question swirled in her mind, and yet, there was an undeniable pull that urged her to accept. This was fate, wasn't it? A chance to see him again, to possibly make amends for the pain she had caused. Without hesitation, she agreed to the meeting, her heart pounding in her chest. The day of the meeting arrived, and Ginny felt a mix of excitement and anxiety she hadn't experienced in years. She dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that was both professional and subtly alluring, just in case. As she arrived at the venue, her nerves were on edge. She hadn't seen Marco in so long. What would he think of her now? How had he changed? More importantly, would he even want to see her after everything that had happened? As Ginny stepped into the restaurant's empty space, her eyes immediately searched for him. And there he was, standing across the room, looking through some blueprints, was Marco Villanueva. He looked different yet familiar at the same time. He was still as strikingly handsome as she remembered, but there was something different in his demeanor. A quiet confidence, a maturity that spoke of a man who had moved on from the boyish charm he once had. His hair was a little shorter, and there were subtle signs of age around his eyes, but they only added to the sense of wisdom and calm he now exuded. He seemed at peace. For a brief moment, Ginny felt a rush of nostalgia, like she was transported back to the days when she used to wait outside his classroom just to catch a glimpse of him. But this was different. The weight of their shared past loomed heavy between them. "Marco," Ginny said softly, her voice almost betraying the flood of emotions she had kept bottled up for years. He looked up from the blueprints, his eyes meeting hers. For a second, there was something unreadable in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe recognition. But just as quickly, it was replaced by a polite smile. "Ginny," he replied with a nod. "It's been a long time." His tone was calm, almost too calm for Ginny's liking. She had expected more: anger, joy, anything but this cool indifference. It threw her off balance, but she tried to mask her disappointment. "Yeah," she replied, forcing a smile of her own. "It's been a while. I didn't expect this." Marco gestured to the space around them, indicating the project. "I heard you were one of the best in the industry now. I thought you'd be perfect for this project." Ginny wasn't sure how to interpret his words. Was this purely professional for him? Did he really reach out to her just because of her skills? Or was there more to it? She decided to tread carefully. "I'm flattered. I'd love to be a part of it. It looks like an exciting project." As they began discussing the design, Ginny couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in Marco. He was no longer the man who wore his emotions on his sleeve. He had become more composed, more measured in his responses. There was a distance in the way he spoke to her, a formality that hadn't been there before. It was as if he had built a wall between them, and Ginny wasn't sure if she could, or should, try to break it down. Still, throughout the meeting, Ginny's mind raced with memories of their past. She remembered their long walks around campus, the way Marco would hold her hand as they talked about their dreams. She remembered the nights they spent curled up together, sharing stories and laughter. She remembered the look in his eyes when she had told him she was leaving, the hurt, the confusion, the heartbreak. And yet here they were, standing in front of each other as if none of that had happened, as if they were just two professionals discussing a project. But Ginny knew better. She could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface, the unresolved feelings that had never truly gone away. When the meeting finally ended, Ginny lingered for a moment, unsure of how to say goodbye. She didn't want this to be the last time she saw him. There was so much left unsaid, so much she wanted to tell him. "So, Marco, how have you been?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Marco glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I've been good," he replied simply. "Busy with work life, you know how it is." Ginny bit her lip, unsure of how to respond. His answer was so casual, so distant. She had hoped for more, but it seemed that Marco wasn't willing to give her that. "I'm glad to hear that," she said, forcing another smile. "I've thought about you, over the years." For a moment, Marco didn't respond. He seemed to be weighing his words carefully before he finally spoke. "I've thought about you too, Ginny, but that was a long time ago." His words hit her like a punch to the gut. Of course, it had been a long time ago, but hearing him say it out loud made it feel so final. Was that all she was to him now? A memory from the past? Ginny nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Right? Well, I should get going. I'll be in touch about the designs." Marco nodded, his expression neutral. "Thanks, Ginny. It was good seeing you." As Ginny walked out of the restaurant, her heart ached with a mixture of regret and longing. She had wanted this reunion to be different. She had hoped that seeing Marco again would reignite something between them, but instead, she was left feeling more distant from him than ever. That night, as she lay in bed, Ginny couldn't stop thinking about Marco. She replayed their conversation over and over in her head, analyzing every word, every glance. Was he really over her? Had he moved on completely? The thought of him with someone else made her chest tighten. She had walked away from him all those years ago, thinking she was doing the right thing. But now, she wasn't so sure. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, site visits, and design consultations. Ginny threw herself into the project, determined to prove herself professionally. But every time she met with Marco, she felt the tension between them growing. Their conversations were polite but distant, and it became clear that Marco was keeping her at arm's length. One afternoon, after a particularly tense meeting, Ginny couldn't take it anymore. She asked Marco to meet her for coffee, away from the project. She needed to talk to him, to clear the air. As they sat down in a quiet cafe, Ginny took a deep breath. "Marco, I feel like there's something we need to talk about." He looked at her, his expression guarded. "What do you mean?" Ginny fidgeted with her cup, trying to find the right words. "I never really got the chance to explain why I left. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything." Marco's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "I was young, and I didn't know what I wanted. I was scared of losing myself, of not achieving my dreams, and I thought that leaving was the only way to figure it out. But I never wanted to hurt you." For a moment, Marco didn't say anything. He stared at his coffee, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but laced with emotion. "You did hurt me, Ginny. A lot. But I had to learn to move on. You made your choice." Ginny's heart sank at his words. She had hoped for forgiveness, for some sign that there was still a chance for them. But it seemed that Marco had built walls around his heart, and she wasn't sure if she could ever break through them. The coffee shop meeting between Ginny and Marco had left Ginny emotionally drained. The conversation had not gone the way she had hoped, and she realized just how much time had changed Marco. He was no longer the open, vulnerable man she had left behind years ago. He had built up walls around his heart, and now she felt as though she was on the outside looking in. As she walked out of the cafe, the weight of her past mistakes hung heavily on her shoulders. How could she ever repair the damage she had caused? Could she even begin to? The weeks that followed felt like a slow burn for Ginny. She couldn't get Marco out of her mind. Every time they met for the restaurant project, their conversations were professional, but there was always an undercurrent of tension between them. It was clear that they both felt something, but neither of them was willing to address the elephant in the room. Ginny threw herself into her work, hoping that immersing herself in the restaurant design would distract her from her tangled emotions. But it wasn't enough. She found herself replaying moments from their relationship in her head. The happy memories of their love weighed just as heavily on her as the guilt over her decision to leave. The sound of his laughter, the way his eyes would light up when he talked about history, the warmth of his embrace, all of it haunted her. She had walked away from it all, believing that her career was more important, and now she couldn't help but wonder if she had made the biggest mistake of her life. One afternoon, as Ginny sat at her desk sketching out potential designs for the restaurant, her phone buzzed with a message from Marco. It was short and to the point. "Let's meet tomorrow at the site to finalize the interiors. 10 a.m. Ginny stared at the message for a moment, her heart racing. Every time she met with him, it felt like they were walking a tightrope between professionalism and unresolved personal feelings. She hesitated before typing her response, trying to keep her emotions in check. "Sure. See you there." The following morning, Ginny arrived at the restaurant's site early. She walked through the empty space, imagining what it would look like once her design was complete. The high ceilings, the large windows letting in streams of sunlight, the earthy tone she had chosen for the interiors. It was all starting to come together. But as she stood there, her thoughts drifted back to Marco. This restaurant wasn't just a project anymore. It felt like a metaphor for their relationship. a space that had potential, but also one that needed a lot of work to truly come to life. As she waited for Marco to arrive, Ginny's mind wandered to the day she had left him. She hadn't told anyone the full story, not even her closest friends. The truth was, she had been terrified of failing in her career, terrified of being tied down, and terrified of losing herself in their relationship. When the opportunity to study abroad had come up, she had seen it as her way out, her chance to chase her dreams without any distractions. But in doing so, she had run away from the one person who had truly loved her, leaving behind nothing but confusion and heartache. Marco arrived right on time, walking into the space with his usual calm demeanor. He was dressed casually, in jeans and a button-down shirt, but even in his simplicity, he carried an air of confidence. Ginny couldn't help but admire how much he had grown over the years. He had built a successful career, and from what she had gathered, he had made a name for himself in the culinary world. This restaurant was proof of that. "Hey," Marco greeted her as he walked over, his tone neutral but polite. "Hey," Ginny replied, offering him a small smile. "I was just going over the layout. I think we're almost ready to move forward with the final design." Marco nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "Well, that's good. I think this place is going to be great." There was a brief silence between them as they both looked around the space, and for a moment, it felt like they were back in the past, sharing a quiet moment of connection. But just as quickly, the tension returned. The unspoken words between them hung heavy in the air, and Ginny could feel the weight of their history pressing down on her. "So," Marco began, breaking the silence, "you seem to be doing well. Your designs are impressive." Ginny glanced at him, surprised by the compliment. "Thanks. You're doing pretty well yourself. This restaurant, it's amazing, Marco. You've really made something special here." He smiled faintly, but didn't say anything. Instead, he turned his attention to the blueprints laid out on the table, as if the conversation had already ended. But Ginny wasn't ready to let it go. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine between them, when it clearly wasn't. "Marco," she said softly, her voice filled with uncertainty. "Can we talk? Really talk? About everything?" He glanced at her, his expression guarded. "What's there to talk about, Ginny? That was a long time ago." Ginny felt a pang of frustration and sadness. "I know it was a long time ago, but that doesn't mean it doesn't matter. I need you to understand why I left." Marco's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked like he was about to brush her off again. But then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine," he said quietly. "What do you want to say?" Ginny swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. She had to find the right words, the words that had eluded her for so long. "When I left, it wasn't because I didn't love you," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I loved you so much, Marco, but I was scared. I was young, and I didn't know what I wanted. I felt like I had to choose between you and my career, and I wasn't ready to give up on my dreams. I thought that leaving was the only way to figure out who I was and what I wanted." Marco listened in silence, his expression unreadable. Ginny pressed on, desperate for him to understand. "I was selfish," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I didn't think about how much it would hurt you. I didn't think about the consequences. And by the time I realized what I had done, it was too late. You were already gone." There was a long pause, and Ginny's heart felt like it was in her throat. She had laid it all out on the table, her fears, her regrets, her love for him. Now all she could do was wait for his response. Marco stared at the blueprints for a moment before finally looking up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions: hurt, anger, and something else she couldn't quite place. "I loved you, Ginny," he said quietly, his voice laced with pain. "I gave you everything, and you just walked away. Do you know how hard that was for me? To see you leave without even a proper explanation? I waited for you. I kept thinking you'd come back, that maybe you'd realize you made a mistake. But you never did." Ginny's eyes filled with tears as she listened to his words. She had always known she had hurt him, but hearing it from him directly, after all these years, was almost unbearable. "I'm so sorry, Marco," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I need you to know that I regret it every day. I thought I was doing what was best for me, but I was wrong. I lost the best thing that ever happened to me, and I've never stopped thinking about you." Marco looked at her, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something soft in his eyes. But then he shook his head, as if shaking off the emotions that threatened to surface. "It doesn't matter anymore, Ginny," he said quietly. "We're not the same people we were back then. You made your choice, and I had to move on." Ginny's heart sank at his words. She had hoped that this conversation would bring them closer, that it would give them a chance to reconnect. But instead, it felt like Marco was closing the door on their past, locking it away for good. "But can't we?" Ginny started, but Marco cut her off. "No, Ginny," he said firmly. "You don't get to just come back into my life and expect everything to be the same. You hurt me, and I'm not sure I can ever forgive you for that." Ginny's breath caught in her throat. She had expected this, but hearing him say it out loud was still devastating. She had come to this meeting hoping for closure, maybe even a second chance, but now she realized that might never happen. "I understand," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Marco, for everything." He didn't respond. Instead, he turned away from her, focusing on the blueprints once again. The conversation was over. As Ginny walked out of the restaurant, her heart shattered into a million pieces. She had finally gotten the chance to tell Marco the truth, but it hadn't changed anything. He was still hurt, still angry, and she couldn't blame him for that. She had made her choice years ago, and now she was paying the price for it. That night, as she lay in bed, Ginny couldn't stop thinking about Marco. She had lost him once before, and now it felt like she was losing him all over again. The pain was overwhelming, and she wondered if she would ever be able to truly move on from the love they had shared. Ginny woke up the next day with an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. The conversation with Marco at the restaurant site had drained her emotionally, and it weighed heavily on her mind. She had thought that laying her heart out to him, apologizing for her mistakes, would help ease the pain and maybe start the process of healing between them. But instead, it felt like Marco had closed the door on any possibility of reconciliation. As she sat in her apartment, staring at the designs for the restaurant, Ginny's thoughts wandered back to their past once again. There were so many moments she wished she could revisit, so many things she would have done differently if she had known the pain her decisions would cause. Flashback. The beginning of their love, it had been a rainy evening when Ginny first met Marco. She had been running late to her college class, soaked from the downpour, and struggling to keep her books dry under a flimsy umbrella. As she hurried across the campus, she had nearly slipped on the wet pavement when a strong hand reached out to steady her. "Careful there," a warm voice said, and when Ginny looked up, she found herself staring into the kindest eyes she had ever seen. It was Marco, a history professor at the university, though at that time, she had no idea who he was. All she knew was that his presence was calming, and she felt an instant connection. "Thanks," Ginny had replied, embarrassed but grateful for his help. They had exchanged only a few words that day, but it was enough to leave an impression. Over the next few weeks, they crossed paths more frequently, and before long, their casual conversations turned into deeper discussions. Marco was passionate about history, and Ginny found herself mesmerized by his knowledge and the way he spoke with such conviction. He was gentle, thoughtful, and always made her feel like she was the most important person in the room when they were together. Their connection grew, and soon enough, they were spending more time together outside of campus. Their relationship blossomed naturally, filled with late-night conversations about their dreams and aspirations, spontaneous adventures to historical landmarks Marco loved, and quiet evenings spent just enjoying each other's company. Ginny had never felt so understood by anyone before. Marco wasn't just her boyfriend. He was her confidant, her rock, and her biggest supporter. But despite the love they shared, there had always been a lingering sense of insecurity within Ginny. While Marco was established in his career, she was still trying to figure out her own path. She had dreams of becoming a successful architect, but the pressure of balancing her career ambitions with her relationship had started to weigh on her. As her graduation approached, Ginny felt torn between her love for Marco and the opportunities that were opening up for her in the world of architecture. Present day, confronting the ghosts of the past, the memories of their early days together were bittersweet. Ginny had walked away from that love, and now, Years later, she couldn't help but wonder if she had made the wrong choice. She had always convinced herself that she needed to focus on her career, that she couldn't have both love and success. But now, with Marco back in her life, even if only professionally, those old feelings were resurfacing, and they were stronger than ever. Ginny shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. She couldn't afford to let her emotions get the best of her right now. There was still work to be done on the restaurant, and she needed to stay focused. But no matter how hard she tried to push Marco out of her mind, he lingered in her thoughts like a shadow she couldn't escape. Later that afternoon, Ginny decided to visit the restaurant site once again, hoping that immersing herself in the project would help distract her from the emotional turmoil she was feeling. As she walked through the space, envisioning the final design, she couldn't help but think about how much this place meant to Marco. This restaurant was his dream, the culmination of years of hard work and dedication, and she was a part of bringing that dream to life. But it wasn't just about the restaurant anymore. This place had become a symbol of their complicated relationship, a place where their past and present collided in ways neither of them could ignore. As Ginny stood by the large windows, staring out at the bustling city street below, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Marco walking in, his expression unreadable. "Hey," he said, his voice soft but distant. "Hey," Ginny replied, forcing a smile. "I was just going over some final design touches. I think we're almost ready to start the interior work." Marco nodded, walking over to stand beside her. They both stared out the window in silence for a moment, the tension between them palpable. It felt like there were a million things they wanted to say to each other, but neither of them knew where to start. After a few moments, Marco finally broke the silence. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day." Ginny's heart skipped a beat. She had replayed that conversation in her mind countless times since it had happened, wondering if she had said too much or not enough. Now, hearing Marco bring it up, she wasn't sure what to expect. "I was angry," Marco continued, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I still am, if I'm being honest. You left without any explanation, and that hurt me more than you'll ever know. But I've also had a lot of time to think about it, and I realized that we were both young. We were in different places in our lives, and maybe it wasn't the right time for us." Ginny felt a lump form in her throat. Marco, he held up his hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Let me finish. I've been thinking about it, and I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you for what happened. But that doesn't mean I haven't moved on. I had to. I couldn't keep waiting for you to come back." Ginny felt her heart break a little more with each word he spoke. She had hoped that they could find a way to move forward, but hearing him say that he had moved on felt like the final nail in the coffin of their relationship. "I'm happy with where I am now," Marco continued, his gaze still focused on the city outside. "This restaurant, it's everything I've worked for, and I'm proud of it. I'm proud of what I've accomplished. But I'm not the same person I was back then, Ginny. And I don't think we can ever go back to what we had." Ginny's eyes filled with tears, but she fought to keep them from falling. She had known, deep down, that this was the reality of the situation. But hearing Marco say it out loud made it all the more real. She had lost him, not just once, but twice now. And this time, there was no going back. "I understand," Ginny whispered, her voice barely audible. Marco finally turned to look at her, his expression softening for the first time since they had reconnected. "I don't want you to think I hate you, because I don't. I never could. But we both have to move on from the past. It's the only way we can move forward." Ginny nodded, even though her heart was screaming in protest. She wanted to tell him that she still loved him, that she regretted leaving more than anything, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. Marco had made his decision, and she had to respect that. "Thank you for being honest with me," Ginny said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I wish things could have been different." "So do I," Marco replied softly. "But we can't change the past." There was a long silence between them, the weight of their words hanging in the air. Ginny felt like she was standing at the edge of a precipice, about to step into the unknown. She had come back into Marco's life hoping for a second chance, but now she realized that wasn't possible. The chapter of their love story had come to an end, and it was time for her to accept that. "I should get going," Marco finally said, breaking the silence. "There's still a lot of work to be done on the restaurant." Ginny nodded, unable to find the words to respond. As Marco turned to leave, she watched him go, her heart aching with the realization that this was truly the end. Once he was gone, Ginny stood in the empty restaurant, the silence around her deafening. She felt like a part of her had been ripped away, and she wasn't sure how to move forward from this. But deep down, she knew that Marco was right. They couldn't change the past. All she could do now was learn from it and try to move on. As she walked out of the restaurant, Ginny made a silent promise to herself. She would focus on her career, on becoming the best architect she could be. She would pour all of her energy into her work, just as Marco had with his restaurant. And maybe in time, she would find peace. But even as she made that promise, Ginny knew that a part of her would always love Marco. He had been her first love, her greatest love, and no matter how much time passed, that would never change. Weeks had passed since Ginny's emotional conversation with Marco at the restaurant, and life had fallen into a strange routine for her. She threw herself into her work, focusing on every minute detail of the restaurant project as if it was the only thing that mattered. But even as she sat at her drafting table, sketching out the finishing touches on the interior design, Marco was always there in her mind, his presence like a ghost she couldn't shake. Every line she drew, every decision she made was haunted by the knowledge that they were building something beautiful together, yet they were farther apart than ever. Ginny had tried to stay away from the restaurant site as much as possible, opting to work remotely instead. She couldn't bear to see Marco every day, to watch him move through the space with a calm detachment that only reminded her of how much she had lost. It was easier to keep her distance, to focus on the work, and pretend that her heart wasn't breaking all over again. But staying away didn't make the pain any less real. It only made it worse, leaving her to deal with the emptiness in the solitude of her apartment, where the memories of their past love loomed large. The day Ginny had left Marco years ago had been the hardest day of her life, and the memory of it still stung like a fresh wound. She had known it was coming for weeks, months even. Their relationship had become strained as she neared graduation. The once effortless connection they had shared was now weighed down by the pressure of Ginny's career aspirations and Marco's steady life as a professor. He had wanted stability, and Ginny had craved freedom to pursue her ambitions. They were headed in different directions, and neither of them had known how to bridge the gap. "I can't do this anymore," Ginny had said quietly, her voice trembling as she stood in front of Marco in his apartment. She had rehearsed the words 100 times in her head, but now that they were finally out, they felt wrong. They felt like a betrayal. Marco's face had been a mask of confusion and hurt. "What are you saying, Ginny? Where is this coming from? I need to focus on my career. I need to see what's out there for me," Ginny had replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I'm not ready to settle down yet, Marco. I don't want to hold you back." Marco had taken a step toward her, his eyes pleading. "You're not holding me back. We can figure this out together. We've always figured things out together." But Ginny had already made up her mind, even though every part of her heart was screaming at her to stay. "I need to do this alone," she had said, her voice barely above a whisper. The look on Marco's face was something she would never forget. The hurt, the disbelief, the sense of abandonment. It was all there, written clearly in his eyes. But he hadn't fought her on it. He had simply nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat, and let her walk away. It had been the hardest thing Ginny had ever done, and she had never stopped wondering if she had made the biggest mistake of her life that day. Ginny sighed as she leaned back in her chair, staring at the incomplete designs in front of her. She had wanted to be successful, to make something of herself, and in many ways she had achieved that. But at what cost? She had sacrificed the love of her life for a career that, while fulfilling, had never filled the void that Marco had left behind. Just as she was about to close her laptop for the day, her phone buzzed on the table. It was an invitation to the grand opening of Marco's restaurant. The event was only a week away, and suddenly the reality of everything hit Ginny like a tidal wave. This was the final step in the project, the moment they had been working toward for months. But it was also the moment that symbolized the end of her time with Marco for real this time. The restaurant would open, the project would be finished, and Ginny would have no more reason to stay in his life. She stared at the invitation for a long time, unsure if she could face him again. But deep down, she knew she had to go. She couldn't keep running from her feelings, from the choices she had made, from the person she had become. If nothing else, she needed to see the restaurant finished, to see Marco's dream realized. It was the least she could do after everything. The night of the grand opening arrived faster than Ginny had anticipated. She stood outside the restaurant, her heart racing as she watched the bustling crowd milling around the entrance. The restaurant looked beautiful, just as she had envisioned. Warm lights glowed through the windows, and the chic, modern design they had worked so hard on was the perfect blend of elegance and comfort. It was a space that invited people in, a place that felt alive with possibility. Ginny took a deep breath and walked inside. The interior was even more stunning than she had imagined. Guests mingled around tables, admiring the decor, and waitstaff circulated with trays of food and wine. It was clear that Marco had pulled out all the stops for this event. The restaurant was a success, and Ginny felt a swell of pride knowing she had been a part of it. As she moved through the crowd, she finally spotted Marco standing near the bar, talking to a group of guests. He looked different tonight, more confident, more at ease than she had seen him in a long time. He was in his element, the proud owner of a restaurant that reflected his passion and vision. But as Ginny watched him from a distance, her heart ached with the realization that he had built this life without her. He had moved on, just as he had said. Just as she was about to turn and leave, Marco's eyes met hers across the room. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The noise of the crowd faded into the background, and all Ginny could see was him. The look on his face was unreadable, a mixture of surprise, sadness, and something else she couldn't quite place. He excused himself from the group and made his way toward her, his expression softening as he got closer. "Ginny," he said, his voice gentle but guarded. "I didn't think you'd come." Ginny smiled faintly, her heart pounding in her chest. "I almost didn't, but I couldn't miss this. The restaurant, it's beautiful, Marco. You did it." Marco looked around the room, his eyes filled with pride. "We did it. You were just as much a part of this as I was." Ginny shook her head, tears threatening to spill over. "No, Marco. This is your dream. I was just here to help bring it to life." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything left unsaid hung between them, thick and suffocating. Ginny wanted to tell him how sorry she was, how much she had regretted leaving him all those years ago. But she didn't know if it would make a difference now. "I'm proud of you," Marco said softly, his voice cutting through the silence. "For everything you've accomplished. You've become everything you set out to be." Ginny swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. "I thought that's what I wanted. But now, I don't know." Marco's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Ginny took a deep breath, finally allowing herself to say the words she had been holding back for so long. "I thought I needed to focus on my career, to prove that I could make it on my own. But I never stopped thinking about you, Marco. I never stopped loving you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and raw. Ginny's heart raced as she waited for Marco's response, unsure of what he would say. She had laid everything out on the table, and now all she could do was hope that he still felt something for her. Marco looked at her, his eyes searching hers for a long time. Then, to her surprise, he reached out and gently took her hand in his. "I never stopped loving you either," he admitted quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "But I built a life here, Ginny. I moved on in so many ways. I don't know if we can go back to the way things were." Ginny nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't expect us to. I needed you to know how I feel. I've spent so long running away from it, and I couldn't do that anymore." Marco squeezed her hand, his expression softening. "Maybe we can go back, but that doesn't mean we can't start over." Ginny looked up at him, hope flickering in her chest. "Do you mean that?" Marco nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "We both changed, Ginny. We're not the same people we were back then, but maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we can start fresh, with everything we've learned." Ginny felt a surge of emotion wash over her. After everything they had been through, after all the pain and heartache, Marco was offering her a second chance. A chance to start over, to build something new together. "I'd like that," Ginny whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Marco smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "Me too." And in that moment, standing in the restaurant they had built together, Ginny knew that this time they would get it right. They had both made mistakes, both hurt each other in ways that couldn't be undone. But they had also grown, learned, and changed. And now, they had the chance to start over, not as the people they once were, but as the people they had become. In the months that followed, Ginny and Marco took things slow. They spent time getting to know each other again, not as the young, reckless couple they had once been, but as the older, wiser people they had become. They went on long walks, talked for hours about their hopes and dreams, and slowly rebuilt the trust that had been broken so many years ago. Marco's restaurant became a success, with people raving about both the food and the warm, inviting atmosphere. And Ginny found a new sense of purpose in her work, using her talents to help other aspiring restaurateurs bring their visions to life. But more than anything, Ginny and Marco found their way back to each other. Their love, though scarred by the past, was stronger now, tempered by time, distance, and the lessons they had learned along the way. And this time, they knew that whatever challenges came their way, they would face them together. As Ginny stood beside Marco at the grand opening of his second restaurant, her heart swelled with pride and happiness. She had found her way back to the man she loved, and this time, she wasn't going to let him go. Happily ever after, it turned out, wasn't about going back to the past. It was about building a future together. Hope you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to like it and subscribe to our channel. Your participation is essential so that we can continue to bring you more incredible stories. Share it with your friends to help our channel grow. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.